Hi everyone, Mel Gabby here, and welcome to Ordinary Life, Simple Days. So this is new in the series of lives that I'm doing, where I cover sort of the slower days, the travel, and reflections on everyday life, creativity, psychology, and things I notice along the way. So in this live, I share how I arrived there. For more than 25 years, I've been working in mental health and wellbeing, travelling in my camper van, writing in Devon, Kent and Somerset now, exploring places, their histories, working with oracle cards as reflective prompts, and more recently discovering the pleasure of slowing everything down. So did you know, at the last count, when I was working for the local authority, there was about 3,000 apps that had been created at the time. I listened to a podcast today, and he said there's now over 1 million apps that have been developed. So when I'm talking about apps, I mean, these little apps that we get on our phones, but how many apps can you actually store on your phone? Now, and some of those apps will constantly be using. So, most of us have some social media. We might have cloud, email, photos, YouTube, Instagram, banking apps. What else? Calendar, notes, search engines, and more. Contacts. I've got a step tracker. It's not tracking me on my bike now. Zoom, Quora, Pinterest. So they're a lot of the apps that we're familiar with. And the conversation I wanted to talk about, which came out of this podcast that I was listening to today, I just need to move this a little bit, is, has the human brain reached information capacity? Because he was talking about, and I'm noticing this, is there are lots of people doing podcasts, there are lots of coaches and therapists, there are lots of courses you can do online, there are webinars, 30-day challenges, fitness lives, yoga, meditation. There is a massive amount of information that we can access, and now we've got ChatGPT and Google and Claude and all the other things. We can go online and ask anything, or we can go on Quora, ask a question, and wait for everybody else to give their answer to it. So there's a couple of angles I've got on this, but the first one was when he said, how many apps are there? I thought, wow, that is massively increased since I was working on an app in the local authority. And then thinking about how many apps do you store on your phone? And then how many emails do we get? And how many podcasts do we listen to? And how many TV shows do we watch? And how much scrolling do we do? So this is like, does it get to the point where the human brain has reached information capacity? And there is a possibility that's the case, because of what they're finding. I was listening to some of the research today, is that lots of people are exploring, they're asking questions, Google, how do I, or tell me more about. They're researching all sorts of different websites, and may go on my website or somebody else's website, but nothing much happens after that. And this led me to think about a couple of things I've been thinking about in the meantime. So this isn't like, is it simply the argument that a lot of people put forward that we're watching so much short form content that it's spiking our dopamine, and our dopamine receptors are wearing out, just like, the brake disc can on your car. If you overuse something, does it actually wear it out? And has it destroyed our attention? And we know that our attention is a commodity. If you watch YouTube and you don't pay for premium, there'll be lots of ads on there that are trying to get you to part with your money. If you on TV and you're scrolling, you might see ads for cars. You watch football, these ads for slot machines or gambling. So ads are everywhere. We are like, we're slim picking. If we do lots of searches, the data is gathered that says what are we more likely to buy and spend our money on. So of course our attention is key, and every platform, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, are changing their algorithms so that they can get you online and keep you online, as well as get people to put ads on there. And lots of us YouTubers are also having the carrot held to say, if you get more listeners, you get more subscribers, you can get monetized, you can make some money. Now that'd be great, but that's not what's motivating me. What's motivating me is we finally got some free tech that we can use where I can share my 25 years of working in mental health and well-being, working with clients, running teams, dealing with all sorts of different issues that come up in mental health, and the kind of questions that I see floating around sometimes when I dip into Cura. But Cura is like one of those black holes where I go down it and now I don't open it because I know I might not come back for a while. But also it's interesting to see what's trending and what kind of things is capturing people's attention and what is it feeding into. And so the idea is if our brains are full to capacity, where you're working all day, especially if you're on a laptop, a desktop at work, and you're working on the screen all the time already, you've got that constant focus, and then we run our phones and we are constantly engaged. And I've been guilty of that as well. I got to the stage of doing a lot of scrolling. But also I was kind of enjoying what was coming through Instagram, because somebody was making shirts out of old material, someone was going to charity shops and refashioning the clothes, someone else was making belts out of leather, and someone else was putting all sorts of different tiles and making mosaics, all of those really cool stuff that we see. But also what's intersped with that is lots of other stuff I don't want to watch. And that's been my experience a few times in the last 6 months where I've been, no, that's actually not what I like with that platform, but I digress a little bit. So like I said, we've got extraordinary access to knowledge now. When we were kids, if you're in your 50s, you had to go to the library or it was word of mouth, or whatever you was learning in school. And now you can put subjects in there and find anyone who's talking on a podcast, who's writing books, courses, Substack, YouTube, Google, AI experts, all of that. So we can spend every hour learning something. But one of the first things I wanted to say about this, and I've seen this happen a lot over time, is that we can spend a lot of time like digesting information, but learning something and integrating isn't the same process. It's not the same. So you can listen to 3 hours of a psychology podcast about attachment and still not know what to do about the relationship you're in. You can understand what I've been talking about, dopamine intellectually, while spending another 4 hours scrolling. But you're burning out your dopamine receptors. But also the second point is there's a lot of superficial understandings about these topics that float around on the Instagrams and the YouTubes and the Facebooks. So you can understand it intellectually, but it doesn't mean to say that you really understand what that means for you and your life. You can also spend 5 personal development courses, and become extremely knowledgeable about why you're stuck while remaining stuck. So we will at some point do a different conversation on, even though I've called it ordinary days, these are my ordinary days, but we'll do a different conversation about why sometimes, what some of the things are to consider if you're thinking about going to see a coach or a therapist. Because we can ingest all this information, and what we know when we do research, so whether you do a master's or a PhD, is the idea is to go and consume lots of information. You start reading what everybody has wrote about the thing that you're researching. So when I was doing my master's, I did it in race, culture and difference. So I did loads of research on historically how the designations of race came about, the categories of lived experience, culture, what it meant, what mixed race meant, language changes over time, all sorts of things. But I read all sorts of research papers to see what questions has someone already asked, what was the conclusions, what was the sample size that they used, who was in that sample, and is there some evidence that we rely on some of their outcomes. So it teaches you how to become more discerning, even with a plethora of what looks like really credible information, and not all information is published. So we've got to be aware of bias. But personally, you can think, I really would like to learn X and do a personal development course or a course of photography or become a coach. So when I started my training as a therapist, even though initially I wasn't sure if I was ever going to do the full-on therapy training, I realised that I really love learning the psychology, the different theories about human distress and change, and wanted to continue. That then turned into a career, so the commodity was worth the investment. And since then, I have bought some personal development courses and done half of them and not really utilised the information that was in there. And you can do too much. We can do too much searching. So the other thing to be aware of is you may already know when you're searching that you need more sleep, you need more money, that you might need to leave your job, you need some friends, you need help with a child, you need to stop drinking, you need to make a decision, you need somewhere affordable to live, or you need someone to sit with you while you work out what the hell is happening. So it takes you to the question of, have our brains reached capacity? So even if you go online and ask, how do I improve my sleep? How do I make more money? And putting that into YouTube, you're going to come up with a lot of podcasts. And over time, it takes a while to listen to several to see that. So say like marketing, I've listened to so many people that will say, you need to create a funnel. And then somebody else will say, no, you need to create a website. Funnels are dead. No, you need to do a webinar. And so you have different people from their experience sharing what they believe is the right approach to get you what you want. But everyone's different. And again, this is another conversation I'll have at another time about how we formulate from the information that we used to get when we were meeting clients for the first time. And so I'm going to do a separate section on that to show you what we do as clinicians, because you never go on the first bit of information that you've read. So when we got referrals, we'd read it on the page or in the letter. You don't go on the next bit of information, you don't get on the next. You've always got an open hypothesis. But if you go online and say, how do I sleep better? How do I make more friends? It's also about who's credible out there that is sharing some information that actually is useful with most people, for example, because not all information is applicable to everyone, and that's the other thing, because we're all diverse by nature. So this is when we can start to feel overwhelmed or stuck. Then we've got to ask, what is it we're really searching for? Because we're not always searching for information. Sometimes we're searching for certainty. And at the moment, lots of people are struggling because life feels uncertain, and there's all sorts of things going around the different platforms that are feeding into the fear, feeding into the rabbit hole that many of us can go down. And I've been down a few, but you also have to say, okay, maybe that's a possibility. But how many of us were told that everything was going to end in 2000, the clocks weren't going to work and the computers were going to blow up, or maybe to get some money out of the banks because the banks weren't going to be able to do that anymore? You know, so there are things that people can fear that come true, and there are lots of things that never come true. And sometimes we need reassurance that we're making the right decision, like with the work that I do with clients. And one of the toughest things to do is sit with somebody, and when they're saying, I'm at a crossroads, I don't know whether to go in that direction or that direction. And I've still got a human part of me that wants to help them make that decision easier and the right decision. But who knows what the right decision is? Because how do you define what is the right step or the right decision next? So sometimes we want to feel hope when we feel life is flat. So we've got some podcasts. I listen to, I've forgotten his name now, something melancholic. But I like the podcasts because they sound hopeless and flat a lot of the time. But he's very philosophical, and he brings in research, and he brings in past and modern research and philosophy to look at a lot of the things that we think but don't tell people. Some of the things that really worry us, that we see in society, the half glass full kind of stuff. And it's not wrong to go down and have a sort of shared dialogue or thinking process with that, because he'll bring in different angles. And that's one of the reasons I like listening to that, because it's great to have pop psychology and positive psychology, reframing, NLP, all of these things that we can do to optimize our life and feel better. But sometimes we don't want to get out of bed, we feel flat, we feel bored, and we want to give up, and we say, what is the point to life and our existence? And we might need to go down that rabbit hole for a while. Don't always want to live there too long. But we might also be looking for stimulation because we're bored. And I know that that's been my thing sometimes, because I can get bored very easy. My brain is used to, ever since I was studying, it's used to having endless amounts of information. So I've got to be strict with myself sometimes to say stop, turn off, go to sleep, do something different. Sometimes it's around belonging. So we'll go on a site, read what everybody else is saying. It's like, yeah, they're saying the same thing as I've experienced. So it can be about that. And sometimes and often, and that's why I share some of my personal stories, is because we're articulating what other people are experiencing. And that's a key thing that I noticed years ago when I first started practicing as a therapist, is sometimes it was the first time people have ever shared what they really felt and thought about things. Other times it's about permission, or it's a distraction, validation, a solution, explanation, novelty. So what we're saying is, underneath this desire to kind of keep consuming information and searching online, is this disharmony or awkwardness or uncomfortableness that we feel. And that's why a lot of the tarot and the oracle are really popular at the moment. The highest rate of I'll have to keep an eye on battery, so I'll let you know if it looks like the battery's going to go, or maybe half an hour. Let me check. That'll do. So being aware of what you might be experiencing is part of the way there. Working out what you are seeking and wanting to read about and discover more can be like opening the door. Like many of us look up our symptoms before we go to the GP, and the GP's probably heard countless times now. I went on ChatGPT and he told me that it's maybe a gallbladder problem, and then the doctor just stares at you. So that's a possibility, but that's the process of developing a hypothesis. We don't know it's true, and we don't know it's not true. It's a possibility, so we need to keep open-minded. And the problem is there can be bias with how people who will veer us to thinking about things more in one way, and that's why we've got to be mindful as well of the kind of inner critic and the inner voice that we have in terms of how we see the world. So if we feel like we're searching for something, so I see seekers at the wellbeing events that I go to, they want to experience sound healing, Reiki, do a yoga session, listen to a talk, maybe make some notes, and they take something back with them. Are they implementing any of the insights and ideas they've got? I don't know. It would be good to see how many of them then are starting to use what they've learned and discovered that makes a difference to what it is they're seeking. So increasingly as well, out of all the information out there, how do you figure out what is a good course, what is a credible podcast? Are these guests, you know, have they garnered this research? Is it evidence-based research? Whilst knowing that not all research has come through, and sometimes it challenges the so-called evidence-based. So it's quite a mire to move through. And especially when clinical language that I would have been using but wouldn't have been using with my friends, for example, because it was in the clinical corridors that we had these conversations where we talked about trauma and ADHD and narcissism, attachment, menopause, dopamine, burnout, autism, nervous system, toxic relationships, and then in the spiritual circles, manifestation, law of attraction, and then things like depression, anxiety. And we've all been familiar with that for a long time, but our understanding of why we get that is still evolving, because some of the original reasons have shifted now that we've got brain research. And especially if it's a 60-second clip, and people can be quite convincing. You hear something, this is the latest treatment for, and then you'll have a plethora of people who will argue against it and a plethora of people who will argue for it. And there's nothing more that, some of the platforms like than two factions arguing against each other. And you see this on Quora as well. So you've got to be able to go, it's a 60-second clip about ADHD. So I'll give you an example. When I was working as a clinician and I was running a mental health service where I had clinicians. So the example, I'm just going to pull up the example so I can see it. So someone would send a referral to my service and they would say, we think this child, this teenager, or this parent, the adult mental health ones, has ADHD. So if we're going to use a very superficial understanding of that, we might say, well, it's now become more regular, everyday conversation. You haven't got focus, you haven't got attention, you're scattered, your stuff's everywhere. So we might have that on the referral form. If it was young people, it might be can't make friends, is always arguing, doesn't sleep, all of those other things. So you have a collection of symptoms, but you wouldn't just listen to the symptoms and diagnose on that basis. We'd have a 3-step program process to start with. We'd have an assessment where we talk to the family, how has it been like this? What are you noticing? What have the school noticed? What's the child noticing? Where do they struggle? Where are they doing okay? Then you talk to the school. Then you do something called an SDQ, which is a strength and difficulty questionnaire, which was still being used last time I was around local authorities. That would give an indication whether the ADHD shows up in all contexts. And if it did, then it might mean that we need to make a referral to the specialist CAMHS department or the adult mental health to say this child or this adult, it looks like they might need an assessment. And then they would have another series of deep assessments. And I was reading something online the other day where somebody says there was a difference between one assessment they had, which was very short, and another one that took about 5 days and 2 separate appointments, which is usually, I think, the amount of time for a in-depth assessment of ADHD and ASD. Now, attachment and trauma used to be more talked about in social care and education departments in local authority, because attachment theory has been long connected to social work theory about children developing attachment to their parents and how they grow up if there's trauma, if there's domestic abuse, if there's drug addiction in the families. So we used to be really aware of that as a conversation around that child may be struggling to form an attachment and this is how that's showing up. But it wouldn't necessarily be something that was clinically diagnosed. We'd still hypothesize and we say, okay, what happens now? So in the case of young children, we used to have drama therapy, and they might have 30 sessions with a drama therapist where through play and through drama and play therapy as well, they are starting to work on attachment issues and how they manifest in that counselling relationship, in that drama therapy. And then the idea around toxic relationships has become much more mainstream, but there are very few people that are qualified to do an assessment. Even clinicians, even therapists, coaches are not trained to do assessments to work out whether someone has any psychopathology, what kind of domestic abuse it is, although it's easy to say what some of that is, whether coercion has taken place or whether or not they're a narcissist. And there's very few clinicians, and I used to read a lot of Eleanor Greenwald's work. So you can't do a 60-second clip on this. You can make a statement like, now I've had my diagnosis, I feel like I understand myself better and why I'm always forgetting X. There's multiple ways you can put something in a clip, but it doesn't mean to say that they are factual and that is information to take on board. Because if you're struggling with any of those things, then ADHD and ASD is normally in the UK diagnosed. You may go to your doctor and get sent to adult or children's mental health. You might go on a waiting list. It depends on the area that you live in, and it's usually a sort of 3-stage process at least with ADHD and ASD. And then they might try out some medication. But they will want to know, and there should be a plan as to how to support that child or that adult. It's a little bit different in adult services. When it comes to depression and anxiety, there are scales that we use in clinical services to break down how depression turns up in your life from day to day. So it'll be things like, how long have you felt like this? Has there anything happened recently to bring that forward? So what my point is, I've worked in mental health for 25 years and ran these mental health services, and I'm not certain in all cases of when people come through that what's on paper is actually what the problem is. So we have to use tools to try and dig a bit deeper to generate more hypotheses, and then we might discuss that with the other team, and then we might try some things. And we might say, actually, this will work if you're struggling with this. In the meantime, it may help. So once you've worked clinically or researched the subjects, that's when you know how quickly certainty starts disappearing when you go deeper. So I could have a hypothesis when I was researching, which means a general sort of idea as to why I think what I was thinking. And even though I uncovered loads of research and read loads of books, I knew who's involved in the changes in language, what happened politically in terms of how people identify themselves and the little check boxes we have, and how this came about and how that varies between America and the UK. But there's no one approach you can give to that subject because context is also a big part of this. So I'll give you an example. If a friend says to you, so one of the things we used to do when I was running the mental health service, we used to get funding every so often from the government, and we went through a phase where we were funding mental health training to go into schools and into professional services. And we might go in and talk about mental health, what's the DSM, which is the psychiatrist's Bible, anxiety, depression, ASD, ADHD, schizophrenia, psychosis, eating disorders, and the other things that come from psychiatry. Then we might say, this is the kind of work and referrals that we get come into our service. And then we'll say, this is how we approach a concern that somebody has. So a teacher might ring me up and say, I've got a concern about this boy or this girl, they're 14, and they give me some information. And then I might ask more questions. So we teach them how we did the first few layers. So we say, we've got a 14-year-old girl, she's coming to school, some of the mums told you that she's crying, she's getting really upset, she won't do her work. What would you make of that? And they might say, oh, maybe she's got something going on at home, she hasn't slept well, something like that. And then we say, okay, more information. Now you notice she's got some bruises on her arm, she's wearing some really nice new clothes, pairs of trainers. but she looks different, she looks tired. Now we might be thinking a little bit more darker, maybe is she hanging around with other older people? Is she being coerced in any ways? Who is she linking with? And then we might take that information back and say, no, there's no bruises, but she's lost a lot of weight. She's not sleeping at night. Is she eating? So we might say, is she eating? Is this an eating disorder that's developing? So what I'm sharing is we would share bits of information. We'd say, now what comes to mind? What would you do? What would you do each time? And we were shown that it's okay not to know for a while, unless it's an emergency, unless we were dealing with a crisis. And if we're dealing with a crisis, we go to A&E, or we bring in a psychiatrist and we get someone assessed. So if it's not an emergency, it's okay to hold that hypothesis in mind. So it's called holding in mind. And when we got the referrals into our service, sometimes we had loads of information from the teacher, and we know the way teachers write when they're describing something in comparison to a parent. Or we might just have a few bits of information that were shared with the doctor, because the doctors tended to write very little. And we said that's okay, because our job is to ask all the information. And we would do a thorough assessment. So we wouldn't diagnose, we wouldn't say they've got depression, they've got anxiety, or they're likely to have this. But we might veer towards any one of those things, and then we'd have a look at what are the actions that we might take to start to help support the person that we're talking about and their family, if they're with their family or their school or other professionals. So if I'm working with an adult and it's a client, how long have you not been sleeping? Any other thoughts that are going through your head? Anything going on at the moment? Yeah, I've just lost my nan. Okay, you're going through the grieving process. You just broke up with your boyfriend, so that's reactive depression. So we're kind of making this assessment, but we're not assessing you to see whether you've got something wrong with you. We're just saying, okay, what's the likelihood? So we add a layer, add a layer, add a layer, and we do this formulation. So it's a tiny amount of information to start with, but we don't do what kind of happens online, is you read something and you make an assumption straight away. Tiny amount of information, rapid interpretation, confident conclusion, and then the next thing. And that's what we've got to be really mindful of, especially now with all sorts of people. Sharing your own experience is one thing. I can share my experience of when I was depressed, when I've had anxiety, when I've had stage fright, when I've had PTSD after my car accident. I can share my experience of that, how it affected me, and the meaning I attributed to it. And that might align with someone else, or it might be different. But when we read something online where we're trying to discover why am I so depressed? Is it because of what I eat? Or how can I optimize my performance? So I'll go on a personal development website, and they're getting a bit of a rap at the moment in a negative way, because it's this idea of constantly doing things to increase your performance mentally, physically, at work. So often as well, we can end up just saturated. And now you get saturated with information. Because I have a tendency, I love discovering things and reading about something and going, oh, wow, I never thought about it like that. That's great. I don't know if that's a dopamine hit or something else. Sorry. But if I'm wanting to explore one of my clinical topics a bit more, I might go and read Eleanor Greenberg, who is incredibly specialised in psychopathology. I might listen to Sam Vatkin, who's he's a professor and does psychopathology, narcissism, narcissistic disorder, personality disorder. That's very clinical. If I want to listen to someone who can relate a little bit more to everyday life, there's a lady I listen to whose name I can't remember at the moment, will come to me. And I also like Dr. K, because Dr. K specialises in working with young men who are gamers, who tend to be stuck at home all the time, not socialising, and also blends Eastern and Western psychology and evidence-based research. I might listen to other people because their experiences and their perspectives are what I like. But this is where, when we're saturated, we need to close the laptop, turn off, and start practicing how we start to tune with ourselves. And I talk about that on other podcasts, where we need to turn down the noise in order to hear the clarity that's coming to us. But if you get cognitive overload, if you get overwhelmed, if you get overstimulated and you're struggling, this is where thinking about going to see a therapist or a coach might help. However, we have had a plethora, a massive, I've never seen anything like it in the last few years, expansion, especially in the coaching world, because therapy is quite, it's not totally regulated, but it's kind of partly regulated. So in the UK, for trainers therapists, you will sign up to the BACP, their Code of Conduct and Ethics, or the HPC, which is also social workers and clinical psychologists, and think educational psychologists. So there's a certain standard of training that's expected, which is normally a diploma, 450 hours for a counsellor. Psychotherapists, I think, is similar, but the requirement to be in therapy might be intensive, like 2 or 3 times a week. For a counsellor, it's once a week. It's the standard. You'll have so much coursework, and you might have to do a piece on a particular thing that you specialise in. How is the everyday public going to try and figure out who's the right therapist for you and what modality? I'm going to do a separate podcast on that question. But for this conversation, I wanted to highlight how we are all massively saturated with lots of apps. And one of the cards that I pulled in the Oracle yesterday was about cleaning the house. So we need to clear our minds and stop bombarding it with loads of content. Ask ourselves what we're searching for. If we feel stuck, are we getting overwhelmed? Or is our mental health not in a good place? And do we need to get support? Now, I offer 3-session kickstart session, which is 3 sessions in a month, where you come and we work on some simple things that you can do that might make a difference, so that you can start to get some breathing space and start to reduce the overwhelm and start to have a bit of sense of control in your own life. And that's a Kickstarter, a deep dive. I do a deep dive as well for 2 hours, one-off session. You can sign up with me and have that, and that might be enough. Or I might say, actually working with a therapist or a coach, or getting 6 sessions focusing on this might help you as you move forward, because it's a lot to work through. It's a lot to kind of figure out what's going on. So the first thing that I highlighted is all this information we have access to. The second one is all that information of equal value? No. And if you don't know the industry and you've not done research before, or you're new to some of that, it's very easy to get drawn into, especially when someone sounds really convincing that their package, their workshop, their webinar is going to help you heal, feel whole, help you create the law of attraction, all of that. And there's a lot of information out there that's for free, but one of the other things we need is a roadmap. So if you're trying to work on a particular outcome, it's useful to create a strategy to have a roadmap to help you get there. Whether that is your health, you want to run better, get fitter, lose weight, study something, learn photography, learn yoga, whatever the thing is, we need a roadmap so that we can clear out all the dross and say, this is going to be my focus for this amount of time while I improve and go towards the goal that I have. Otherwise, in overwhelm, we end up getting home, feeling tired, I can't be bothered, I'm going to bed, it's too much, and then get caught in that cycle. And then you feel disillusioned, I've let myself down, I'm disappointed, it didn't work out. So like I said, I'll do a separate session on how to choose, how to work out the models, what I used to do, the types of stuff I had. So if you are looking for any support and help and you want to find ways to do that, that'll be the next live that I do. So do tune in. I'm not sure when that's going to be. I think it might be at the weekend, but they are recorded. I'll put a description in there, and when I get around to it, I will be putting time points. But it's very useful. I'll give you, it's almost like a basic overview to what is a bit of a complex area. So I can help you just navigate that. On type of therapist coach, the modality, what else is involved that helps us improve, what a podcast can help, who to listen to that is maybe got more credibility, what spiritual practice, what productivity system, what morning routine. But what helps personalize it is when you then, and this is what I do with clients, I help them personalize all that information and turn that into a package that is going to work for them. So they can say, right, I'm only going to use this one set of cards for the next 30 days. And I'm going to, and it sounds a bit off because I'm talking about Oracle now, but Oracle is a way to connect with your deeper subconscious. So you could say, as part of my plan is to pull 3 cards a day. I'm going to write a journal, and I'm going to write what comes up for me, how I make sense of it. And then you might book with a therapist and you say, I'm going to talk about this in therapy because this aligned, it didn't align. I want to see how this is. Or you might go to a nutritionist that helps you work out whether you're short of any particular things in your system, magnesium, calcium, vitamin D, that could be affecting your mental health. But you need a roadmap, and you need to just sometimes decide what 1 or 2 things you're going to do. Otherwise, you just stay in a state of stuckness, chronic overwhelm, and cognitive load. So if that feels like a big mouthful, then you might already be at tipping points of cognitive overload. It's just basically your brain's full. And I can feel it. I get signs of it, and I can feel my eyes squinting like that. And I'm like, okay, that's my physical sign to say switch off and stop doing that thing. So this is also about saying, I can do one thing, not lots of things, and I've got a roadmap that I've got some control over, and I can see where that goes. Otherwise, what you do is you just keep getting drawn into fatigue and relentless optimization, or not knowing whether that podcast has got better information than that podcast. And also, when I work with people, it's like, what are you drawn to? What stands out to you? What podcasts, like the one that I listened to today about the apps? I thought, wow, how do you choose? Because I've been struggling just to work out what platform to put my stuff on. And I don't know how many of those there are. I know the main ones, but there are more emerging to put my videos and my writing. You know, writing is like Quora, Medium, Substack, and then my website and more. What do I do? Where do I go? And I've had that dilemma when I was in April. I thought, do I do school? Do I do Patreon? Do I do Substack? Do I do it on my website? And I have to go, okay, what does this one give me? What does that one give me? What's more aligned with where I am now? And that's what I found was the sort of key question to ask. So that was a podcast I listened to this morning. I thought, do you know what? I'm going to make use of that. It's an ordinary day. I was, this morning, I had a bit of time before I had a client. So I had a really nice cup of coffee. I sat in the garden, watched the birds on the bird feeder, enjoyed my coffee, and I've made overnight oats with dates and nuts, put some honey on and some fresh milk, and enjoyed that, carried on watching the birds. And that was like my simple, ordinary day. And while I was getting ready and having a bath this morning, I put on the podcast, and I thought, well, that's been something I've been thinking about, I've been reflecting on, and it's come up sometimes with clients where I help them navigate that landscape. I saw my client, there were some themes that came through that, and then I sat outside and had my stew and got some blackberries to have with fresh yogurt, and that was the simple life. It was raining and I was enjoying all of that. And so sometimes simple life and a really nice experience is about watching the birds, reading Hemingway, what I was doing last week, cycling down by the beach, and I've got a video that will upload to one of the beaches I was at the other day, going to Wells, going to the cathedral, listening to sheep in the next field, picking tomatoes from the, what's it, glass house? What are they called? It's a shed. Where they put some, I keep forgetting what it's called. Picking the tomatoes and making a really nice sauce with the pasta, or getting on the road like yesterday and going left and there was a tractor in front, or going right and there was a drain man. You know, all of these are the aspects of the everyday life. And in order for me to enjoy them, I've got to know when to cut the noise off, close the laptop, stop researching, and constantly just putting input into our brain. Because we can't always be consumers, and we've got to be mindful of our mental energy as well as our physical and emotional energy, and how that gets easily drained and will affect other aspects of our life. So hopefully that's been useful. I'm going to switch off now, and I will look forward to doing the other live, and I'm definitely going to do, like I said, the one that talks about therapy, different models, and all of that jazz. So thanks for listening, and let me know if you watch this as a recording. Like and subscribe, that really helps my channel. Like I said, I'm experimenting with these lives, and let me know what you thought if you watch the recording later and have any questions to ask. You can always send me you can always send me some questions on here and come on to the next live. So if you subscribe, you'll get a notification, I think, of when that is. So thank you for watching, listening, and watching the replay.